Talking Law is the program you're listening to. This is Radio 97, and Despina with us each and every Thursday morning. She's happy to answer your questions. We've had a few questions come through in recent weeks and more on the way, but if you would like to add your question to the list, you can do that by just sending the details. And if you go to the website, radio97.com.au, you'll find all the ways you can get in contact with us. radio97.com.au.
Thank you, Aino. And for this particular topic, we are deep diving into some risks when it comes to buying a home and going under contract. Because recently, Despina, you've dealt with a few people that have unfortunately had some unfortunate circumstances when it comes to going into that contract, and all these things are popping up that they had no idea about. So,
help us, please.
Yeah, help us. What's going on?
So again, this comes back to what I've always said, and that is do not sign a contract until it is checked by a solicitor who is experienced. It is super important. And we still have clients. I only had one last week, a young girl who was buying her first property, didn't get it checked by us, and she went ahead and signed it. Now, and this is not a segment against agents, but the typical story that I hear where people do sign over the weekend or on another time and they don't get a solicitor to check it is that, oh, well, the agent said it was fine. Now, we work with agents. We love working with agents. We work with them every day. They have their role. We have our role. And it's important that we work together. And the agents are not lawyers. They don't have the skills that we do in drafting contracts. That's not their role. Their role is to explain the property, to sell the property in the best way they can, obviously, honestly. But we need to check that contract before they sign it, because these days buying property is not that simple. It can be complex. So we want to talk about a common issue that faces buyers, and that is the risk. When we talk about risk, we want to explain, and we've mentioned before on the show many times, but we want to talk about what happens in Queensland. So in Queensland, that we've had for decades and still is the current law, is basically buyer beware. And within the realm of that, under the REIQ contract, from the day after the contract date, so you sign a contract, the very next day, the risk in that property shifts to the buyer. So it goes from the seller to the buyer. So what does that mean? So that means that we say to buyers, you've got to take insurance cover out. You've got to get that in place, because if something happens to that property, then you're liable or potentially liable. It's a very high risk. Now, normally you might think, okay, that's fine, you know, we'll get insurance cover. But the problem that we've had recently, particularly, and we've had it in the past, but we've had clients where they've signed and they haven't checked the contract, haven't had the contract checked by a solicitor, and there is a tenant. So this is the problem that we're talking about. You sign a contract, the risk shifts to you as a buyer. You're liable or potentially liable for anything that happens to the property, and the property is tenanted. Now, as a buyer, you don't have a relationship with the tenant. The tenant is there because of a relationship with the seller. So if we get to vet contracts before we're told that there's a tenant, so this comes back to disclosure by the seller and the agent, then we say, okay, well, let's change it. Let's have the risk stay with the seller, not shift to the buyer, because that's unfair and unreasonable. 9 times out of 10, or all the time, we get that changed. We negotiate and we get it changed where we have the opportunity to do that. Once the contract is signed and the parties are bound, it becomes more difficult, because then you have to vary the contract, and the seller doesn't have to agree to vary the contract to get that changed. Okay, so more difficult. Hence, get your contract checked before you sign it. Now, there's another aspect to that where we have tenants. Then we know that there are tenants, and we want the risks to stay with the seller. The interesting aspect when we talk about tenants or people occupying the property, what about those situations where it's Airbnb?
They're not always there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, and the REIQ contract does not actually cater for specific disclosure about properties that are Airbnb'd. Therefore, you're relying on the seller and or the agent to properly disclose, to say, this property is actually on Airbnb. It's got another 3 weeks to run. We've already got bookings in advance. Right. So there's a common misconception, I think, out there that agents and or sellers think, well, I don't need to disclose that, because it's not an actual tenant under the legislation that deals with tenancies in Queensland. It's just on Airbnb. So what? you should and disclose it. And for the very fact that the buyer needs to be aware, and the buyer needs to know, well, hang on, the risk should stay with the seller because you've organized this person on Airbnb. It's got nothing to do with me. And if something happens in that property, why am I liable?
Yep.
Okay. Case in point, we mentioned, I think it was last week, about that story at Hollywell, just near us, where the ceiling in the
roof
property, it caved in and it fell on the tenant. Can you imagine if you're a buyer under contract and that happened while you were under contract, and the risk is to you? The risk is you're liable and you're responsible. That is a horrific situation to be in. And all it needed is a solicitor to check the contract, to find out that there is a tenant, and then to negotiate, well, let's just put a special condition in that the risk remains with the seller until it is actually settled.
Yep, that certainly sounds like something that buyers should need to know before they sign the contract. Speaking of signing, is there something that strikes you? It certainly strikes me that people put hundreds of thousands, and these days into the millions sometimes, to buy a property, and yet they sign these things without getting everything checked before they ink that line. Surely it's something that everyone should be doing. You should go and check all of this before you sign anything.
I think it's absurd, to be honest, that people sign contracts without it being checked. And I say that without offending anybody in particular. But 9 times out of 10, there is something wrong with the contract. Okay. And there's something.
Really? 9 times out of 10.
Okay. Maybe. Okay. 80%. I'll say 80%.
But an adjustment that might need to be made.
Often. Yeah.
It could be a very small adjustment, or it could be something major. And why would you risk it? And it would, for us, for example, I mean, we're experts in this area. It would take not very long for us to check a contract. We're not talking about dragging it out for hours and hours and you're going to lose the deal, which I think often some agents, not all, think that might happen. You've got to go to someone who's proactive. You can't go to a solicitor who might sit on it for days. I mean, that's just ridiculous in itself. You've got to review that straight away, or as reasonably as possible when you get that contract in front of you. And you've got to advise the client, okay, I've read it. This is what I'm recommending. Shoot an email over to the agent and request the changes to the contract. It is that simple when you talk about within that context. Buyers, get your contract checked by someone who is experienced. It will potentially save you thousands of dollars down the track.
Yeah, and just a reminder too, those particular examples you gave before about tenants being in a home and you're already under contract, these are real life cases. This happened just recently on the Gold Coast, right?
Yes, we had one client who's buying in a building in Palm Avenue. So that was the Airbnb one. It was never disclosed. We discovered it afterwards, and that was an interesting one. So that probably should have been disclosed up front. So we discovered it afterwards, and we're negotiating a change to the contract so our client isn't liable for anything to do with that Airbnb person or tenant or occupier, I should say. But yeah, we've had other situations where we've discovered that we got a contract that wasn't vetted by us. We're acting for the buyer, and then we see that there's a tenant, a long-term tenant, and we've just negotiated a change that the risk goes back to the seller. So, but this is all extra work, you see, that we have to do for the buyer, which we're happy to do. Well, not happy. We have to do it, right? When we don't vet it and we see a problem. But it's a risk because the seller may not agree. So you need to get it checked before you're bound to that contract.
Exactly. Excellent advice there from Despina Priala from Priala Legal. And if anyone does want to get in touch with you directly, Despina, where can they go?
So they can phone the office 55291 send your questions through to info@prialalegal.com.au or to yourselves. And that's it.
Amazing. We'll catch you next week. Thank you, Desi and Wayne.
We'll see you then.
See you then, guys.
Are you confused about legal jargon? Do you need legal advice but don't know where to turn? Tune in to Talking Law with Despina Priala every Thursday morning at 8:30 on Radio 97. Despina, a leading lawyer with over 20 years of experience, will demystify the law and provide practical advice to help you navigate legal issues. Whether it's a family matter, a property dispute, or a business concern, Talking Law has got you covered. Don't miss out on this valuable resource. Tune in to Talking Law with Despina Priala every Thursday morning at 8:30 on Radio 97.